The day Estelle Washington arrived at the house on Maple Grove Drive in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, with a woman named Keisha standing beside her and a speech prepared about what was best for her son Victor and what kind of wife Victor deserved and what Camille had failed to be over the course of 9 years of marriage. Camille Washington heard the doorbell and came to the top of the staircase and looked down into the foyer below, and she saw her mother-in-law, and she saw the woman standing beside her mother-in-law, and she understood immediately and completely what she was looking at, and what it meant, and what was about to happen, and she said nothing. She stood at the top of those stairs with both hands resting lightly on the railing, and she looked down at the two women in her foyer, and she listened to Estelle deliver the speech she had prepared, and the speech was long, and it was detailed, and it covered many topics, including Camille's failure to produce children. In 9 years of marriage and Camille's professional focus, which Estelle described as an obsession with properties and business that left Victor without the domestic presence he deserved, and Camille's independence, which Estelle described as a form of disrespect toward Victor and the Washington family. And when Estelle finished the speech, she looked up at Camille standing at the top of the stairs and said, "We think it would be best if you found somewhere else to be," and she gestured toward Keisha. When she said "we," as though the presence of Keisha standing in the foyer of a house that Camille owned outright was a self-explanatory statement about what came next, and Camille looked down at both of them from the top of those stairs with the specific, composed stillness of someone who is looking at two people who have no idea what they are standing in the middle of, and she walked down the stairs, and she picked up her handbag from the hallway table, and she walked to the front door, and she opened it, and she walked out, and the door closed behind her with a sound so quiet it was almost nothing. No argument, no raised voice, no tears, no scene of any kind. Nothing that could be described as a reaction, because what Camille Washington felt in the moment she walked out of that door was not the feeling that produces reactions. It was the feeling that produces decisions, and the decisions had already been made 14 months earlier in a lawyer's office in the South Loop of Chicago, and what was happening on the morning Estelle rang the doorbell on Maple Grove Drive was not the beginning of anything new. It was the confirmation that something already in motion was now running and did not require Camille to be in that house for a single additional minute to continue running exactly as it had been designed to run. Stay with me, because what Camille Washington did in the 48 hours after she walked out of that front door on Maple Grove Drive, and what she had been doing quietly and without announcement for the 14 months before that morning, is the part of this story that Estelle Washington never anticipated, and that Victor Washington never anticipated, and that produced 3 separate and sequential events over the following 6 weeks, each of which was quieter than the one before it, and each of which was more permanent than the one before it, and together they produced a situation that no one in the Washington family had any preparation for whatsoever, because no one in the Washington family had ever asked the most basic and most important question available to them about the life Victor Washington had been living for 9 years, which was whose name was actually on anything, and what that meant, and what it would mean when circumstances required it to mean something specific and permanent. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us. If your mother-in-law showed up at your front door with another woman and a prepared speech and told you it would be best if you found somewhere else to be, what would be your very first move? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Camille Washington was born Camille Reeves in the Woodlawn neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Illinois in 1981, and she grew up in a household where money was not abundant, but where the management of what money existed was treated as a serious and important subject that required consistent attention and honest education rather than avoidance. Her father, Jerome Reeves, was a city worker who spent 30 years with the Chicago Department of Transportation, maintaining the infrastructure of a city that most people used every day without thinking about who kept it running and who kept it safe. Jerome was a methodical man and a patient one, and he brought those qualities home from work every evening and applied them to the raising of his daughter with the same steady consistency he applied to everything he did. He sat Camille down at the kitchen table in their Woodlawn home when she was 11 years old, and he showed her a piece of paper with numbers on it, and he explained in plain and specific language what a mortgage was, and what equity was, and what it meant to own something versus what it meant to rent something, and why the difference between those two things compounded over time in ways that determined whether a person built something that lasted or spent a lifetime servicing someone else's investment. He talked about the house they were sitting in and about what it had taken to own it, and about what owning it meant for the family in practical terms that went beyond the emotional satisfaction of having a home and extended into the specific financial reality of what an owned asset does over time compared to what a rented space does over time. He was not a wealthy man, and he was not presenting himself as a financial expert. He was a city worker with a pension and a paid-off mortgage, and he was giving his daughter the clearest and most practical form of love available to him. Camille's mother, Diane, was a registered nurse at a Southside Chicago hospital who had watched her own parents pay rent on the same apartment on the South Side for 40 years and retire at the end of those 40 years with nothing to show for 4 decades of monthly payments except the memory of having made them, and who had decided before Camille was born that her children were going to understand property in a way that she herself had not understood until it was later in her life than she would have liked. Camille had absorbed both of her parents' understanding of money and property with the specific completeness of a child who grows up hearing adults discuss real things in plain language. She studied finance at DePaul University in Chicago and worked 2 part-time jobs throughout her college years to reduce the loan burden she was taking on, and graduated with a degree and a plan and a savings account that was small in absolute terms and significant in terms of what it represented, which was every dollar she had been able to set aside since her first paycheck with the specific and deliberate intention of purchasing property before her 27th birthday, because Jerome had told her at the kitchen table in Woodlawn that the most important financial decision a young person makes is the first one, and that the first one should be about owning rather than renting, and Camille had held that instruction for 16 years before she was in a position to act on it. And when she was in a position to act on it, she did not hesitate. She went to work at a Chicago real estate firm immediately after graduation and spent 2 years learning the mechanics of property acquisition and management and valuation and tenant relationships and maintenance costs and insurance requirements and the legal landscape of property ownership in Illinois from the people who had been navigating that landscape for decades. She saved every dollar she could save during those 2 years, and she kept a spreadsheet of her savings and her target, and she updated it weekly, and when the number reached the down payment she needed, she went out and purchased her first property, a 2-flat in the Bronzeville neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, at the age of 26. With a down payment she had been building since her first paycheck out of college, she rented the upper unit to a family she found through a community connection, and she moved into the lower unit herself, and she managed the property with the same meticulous and systematic attention her father had applied to the city's infrastructure for 30 years. She tracked every dollar of income and every dollar of expense, and the property generated income from the first month, and Camille reinvested the surplus into a repair fund and a future down payment fund simultaneously, because she had understood from the beginning that the goal was not one property. The goal was a portfolio. And within 18 months, she had enough for a second property, and she purchased a single-family home in Bronzeville and rented it to a long-term tenant, and within 2 more years, she had a third property, and within 4 years she owned 5 properties across Bronzeville and Hyde Park, and she had built all of it quietly and without announcing it to anyone outside her immediate family, because she had understood from watching Jerome and Diane that the people who talk extensively about what they are building often build less of it than the people who simply build and trust that the building itself will speak when the time comes for it to speak. And by the time Camille met Victor Washington at a Chicago professional networking event in the fall of 2013, she was 29 years old, and she owned real estate that generated consistent monthly income and that had been appreciating in value since the day she purchased each property, and she had incorporated a property management company called Reeves Properties LLC that managed her own portfolio and had begun taking on management contracts for other Southside property owners, and the business generated consistent monthly revenue, and it was entirely hers. Her name, and only her name, was on every property deed, and her name, and only her name, was the sole member of Reeves Properties LLC, and her name, and only her name, was the authorized signatory on the business accounts and the investment accounts. And this was not a secret, and it was not a strategy in those years. It was simply the administrative reality of a woman who had built everything herself and who had never had occasion to restructure any of it around anyone else, because there had been no one else. And when Victor arrived, she had not restructured it around him either, not because she was planning for anything, but because restructuring it would have required a specific decision and a specific conversation, and neither of those things had been prioritized, and so the structure had remained exactly as it was. Victor Washington was 34 years old when they met, a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company headquartered in the Loop who had grown up in the Beverly neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago in a household that was comfortable without being wealthy, and who had built a solid professional reputation over a decade in pharmaceutical sales that required the specific combination of personal charm and professional persistence that the work rewards consistently when someone possesses both qualities genuinely. Victor was charming and generous and the kind of man who made people feel welcome and valued in whatever space he occupied, and these were genuine qualities, and Camille had recognized them as genuine and had valued them, and had spent 2 years watching them carefully before she agreed to marry him. What Victor did not have was the specific discipline of building wealth rather than spending income. He earned well, and he spent well, and he had at the age of 34 a comfortable apartment, and a good car, and the lifestyle of someone who was doing well professionally, and who had not yet made the specific decisions that convert doing well professionally into owning something that compounds and grows and provides security rather than simply comfort. Camille had made those decisions at 26 and had been building for 3 years when they met, and she did not need Victor to build with her, and she did not ask him to build with her, and she provided the financial foundation of their shared life without making it a conversation, because she had never been a woman who made her contributions to any situation into a conversation unless the situation specifically required it. They married in 2014 and moved into the house on Maple Grove Drive, which Camille had purchased in 2012 and renovated over 2 years, and that stood in its Bronzeville block as the kind of house that communicated without words that the person who had assembled it understood exactly what they were doing. Victor loved the house from the first evening he saw it and moved into it after the wedding with the ease of someone who has been given access to something excellent and who accepts the access without examining the mechanism by which it was made available. His name was not on the deed because the deed had been in Camille's name since 2012, and the subject of adding his name had not come up between them in a specific enough way to produce action, and Camille had not raised it because the house was her asset, and she managed her assets in her name, and the question had simply never been prioritized. Victor's name was not on the house, and Victor's name was not on Reeves Properties LLC, and Victor's name was not on the business accounts, and Victor's name was not on the investment accounts, and Victor understood none of this with any specificity because he had never asked, and Camille had never volunteered it in the specific terms that would have made the structure visible to him, and the life they lived on Maple Grove Drive was comfortable and full and generated no occasion that required the structure to become visible to Victor until the morning it became visible all at once. What neither of them had ever done in 9 years of marriage was sit down together and draw out the financial architecture of their shared life in plain specific language. Victor had never asked the specific questions, and Camille had never offered the specific answers, and the life between them had been full enough and comfortable enough that the absence of those questions and those answers had not felt like an absence at all. It had felt like the ordinary texture of a marriage between two people who were busy and who trusted each other and who had not yet encountered a reason to examine the specific foundation beneath the comfort they were both living inside. The reason arrived on a morning when Estelle rang the doorbell and delivered a speech, and the speech turned out to be not the end of the story it was trying to tell, but the beginning of a completely different story that Estelle had not written and did not know was being written. Estelle Washington had opinions about Camille from the very beginning of the relationship, and she had shared those opinions with Victor with the specific and consistent frequency of a mother who has decided that her son has made a choice she does not endorse and who believes that consistent repetition of her concerns delivered with enough maternal authority will eventually produce a reconsideration. Estelle's concerns about Camille were various, and she returned to them from different angles over the 9 years of the marriage, as though she was searching for the approach that would finally cause Victor to see what she was seeing. She said Camille was too focused on her properties and her business and not focused enough on being present in Victor's life in the ways that mattered to the Washington family. She said Camille's independence was a form of disrespect toward Victor and toward the family he came from, and toward the specific understanding of marriage that the Washington family had always held and that Camille had never embraced. She said Camille's failure to produce children after 9 years of marriage was a deliberate choice that communicated something important about Camille's priorities that Victor needed to take seriously and to address. She said Camille did not make Victor feel like the center of his own home, and this was the complaint she returned to most often and with the most feeling because it was the one most connected to Estelle's specific vision of what her son's life should look like and who should be organizing themselves around him within it. Camille had spent 9 years hearing these opinions relayed by Victor and had responded to them with a measured and consistent calm that Estelle interpreted as arrogance, and that was in fact simply Camille's standard response to information she had assessed carefully and decided did not require a change in her behavior, because the behavior in question was the behavior of a woman who was genuinely present in her marriage and genuinely committed to it, and who had decided that 9 years of genuine presence and commitment was a more reliable argument for her character than any conversation she could have with Estelle about what Estelle thought of her character. What Camille had not fully accounted for was the specific and cumulative effect of 9 years of consistent maternal opinion on a man who loved his mother deeply and who had never developed the practice of examining his mother's conclusions about the people around him against the direct evidence available to him in his own daily life. Victor had absorbed his mother's version of Camille slowly and incrementally, and without noticing the absorption was happening, and by the 9th year of the marriage he had arrived at a place where his mother's characterization of his wife felt more real and more true to him than the wife who came home to the house on Maple Grove Drive every evening. And this is the specific and quiet mechanism of the family betrayal that does the most damage because it does not require anyone to make a dramatic decision. It only requires someone to keep delivering a version of reality to a person who loves them and who trusts them and who eventually stops checking that version against the evidence of their own eyes. Keisha had been introduced to Victor by Estelle at a family gathering approximately 8 months before the morning Estelle rang the doorbell on Maple Grove Drive. And Estelle had described Keisha to Victor as exactly the kind of woman who understood what a man needed from a partner and who knew how to make a home feel like a home, and who had the warmth and the presence and the family orientation that Victor deserved and had not been getting. Victor had met Keisha and found her easy to be around, in the specific way that people are easy when they have been carefully selected to be easy for you specifically, and when the person who selected them has been studying your preferences and your complaints and your mother's complaints about your marriage for the better part of a decade. What Camille had noticed over the 8 months that followed was a quality of distance in Victor that she observed carefully and filed in the part of her mind where she kept things she was tracking without yet naming, a certain carefulness with his phone that had not been there before, a certain quality of performed normalcy when he came home in the evenings that communicated management rather than presence, a certain frequency in his mother's calls that had increased beyond its already significant baseline, and that Victor now took in other rooms rather than in whatever room he and Camille were occupying together. She had watched all of this with the patient attention she brought to everything she observed, and she had not confronted Victor directly about what she was seeing, because she was Camille Reeves, and Camille Reeves did not make accusations without evidence, and did not act on the shape of something when she could wait for the shape to become fully visible. What she had done while she was watching and waiting was something that Victor and Estelle and Keisha had no knowledge of whatsoever. 14 months before the morning the doorbell rang, Camille had called Sandra Okafor and made an appointment and gone to Sandra's office in the South Loop and sat across from Sandra and said, "Sandra, I need you to review everything I own and make sure it is documented correctly and protected completely, and that there is no gap anywhere in any document that gives anyone any claim on anything I built before or during this marriage." And Sandra had said, "Everything is already in your name," and Camille had said, "I know I need you to confirm it completely and close every gap and make it absolutely airtight." And Sandra had spent the following month doing exactly that. And what she confirmed was that every property was titled in Camille's name alone, and Reeves Properties LLC was owned entirely by Camille as the sole member, and the business accounts were in the business name with Camille as the sole authorized signatory, and the investment accounts were in Camille's name with no joint holders, and there was no document anywhere that gave Victor Washington any legal claim on any asset Camille had built before or during their marriage. She left because standing in the doorway arguing was not what the situation required, and she understood this with the complete clarity of someone who has already done everything that needed to be done and who knows that the outcomes are now on their way, and that nothing she could say to the two women standing in her living room would add anything meaningful to what was already in motion. She walked to her car, and she drove to Sandra's office, and she sat down, and she said it happened, and Sandra said, I know what to do, and Camille said, how long? And Sandra said 6 weeks, maybe 8, and Camille said, start today, and Sandra started, and the first of the 3 things that happened in sequence began that same afternoon. The first thing was the sale of the house on Maple Grove Drive, and it happened quickly because the Bronzeville market was strong and the property was in exceptional condition because Camille maintained everything she owned with consistent and meticulous attention, and the listing went live on a Thursday morning and was under contract within 10 days, and the closing was scheduled for 32 days after the listing went live, and none of the parties to the transaction had any reason to know and no legal obligation to disclose that the house was currently occupied by Victor Washington and a woman named Keisha who had been living in it since the morning Camille walked out and who had absolutely no legal standing in the property because neither of their names appeared on any document that had any relationship to who owned the property or who had the right to be there or who had the right to sell it. On a Saturday morning approximately 1 week before the scheduled closing, a representative of the purchasing party knocked on the front door of the house on Maple Grove Drive to conduct a pre-closing walkthrough, and Victor answered the door, and the man introduced himself and explained why he was there, and Victor said this house is not for sale, and the man said it has been listed and under contract for approximately 3 weeks and is scheduled to close next Friday, and he showed Victor the listing documentation, and Victor looked at the documentation and his name was nowhere on it, and the seller of record was Camille Reeves, and Victor stood in the doorway of the house he had been living in for 9 years and felt the specific disorienting sensation of understanding something for the first time that he should have asked about a very long time ago, and that the answer to which had been available to him for 9 years if he had known to ask the question and if he had thought the question needed asking. Victor called Camille, and she did not answer, and he called again, and she did not answer. And he called Sandra Okafor's office, and Sandra's assistant told him that a letter had been prepared for him and would be delivered by courier that afternoon, and the letter arrived at 3:47, and Victor opened it. And the letter was thorough and specific and clear, and it was the second of the 3 things that happened in sequence, and it was more complete than the first. The letter explained that the house on Maple Grove Drive was owned solely by Camille Reeves Washington and had been owned by her since 2012, and was currently under contract for sale, with a closing the following Friday, and that any occupants of the property, without legal standing in the property, would need to vacate prior to the closing date. The letter also listed the 4 other properties in Camille's portfolio by address, and confirmed that all 4 were owned solely by Camille and were being retained by her. Victor called his mother, and Estelle came to the house on Maple Grove Drive that evening, and Victor showed her the letter, and Estelle read it, and read it again, and then she set it on the coffee table and looked around the living room that she had stood in 2 months earlier when she delivered the speech. And she said to Victor, did you know about this? And Victor said, I did not know about any of this, Mama. And Estelle said, whose house did you think this was in? Victor was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I thought it was ours, Mama. And Estelle sat with that for a long time and thought about the morning she had arrived with Keisha and the speech she had prepared and all the things the speech had covered and all the things the speech had not covered, and the most important thing the speech had not covered was the simplest and most basic question available to any person who is about to tell someone to leave a house, which was, whose house is it actually in? Estelle had not asked that question because she had assumed she knew the answer, and the assumption had seemed so obvious that it had not occurred to her that it required verification, and the letter on the coffee table in front of her was the specific and permanent cost of that assumption. Victor attempted over the following days to understand in concrete terms what his position actually was, and the understanding arrived in pieces, each one clearer and more final than the last. He went to the office of Reeves Properties LLC, and the property manager who answered the door was polite and professional and explained that the business was wholly owned by Camille Reeves Washington and that Victor had no role in the business and no access to its accounts and no standing to make any request on the business's behalf. He attempted to contact the tenants in Camille's 4 remaining properties and discovered that every tenant knew Camille by name and knew Reeves Properties LLC as their management company and had never heard Victor's name in any context that suggested he had any connection to any property they were renting. He went to his attorney, and his attorney reviewed the letter from Sandra and reviewed the property records and reviewed the business documentation and delivered an assessment that was measured and direct, and that confirmed what the letter had said, which was that what Camille owned was hers, and what she had protected was protected, and that Victor's realistic options were limited by the structure that had governed these assets throughout the marriage, and that the most productive path forward was to focus on what he could build from this point rather than on what he could recover from what existed. The third thing that happened was not a document, and it was not a delivery, and it was not a formal legal event. It was simply the cumulative and total clarity of understanding what his name was on and what his name was not on, and what that meant in practice for every element of the life he had been living for 9 years. His name was not on the house, and his name was not on the other 4 properties, and his name was not on the business, and his name was not on the business accounts, and his name was not on the investment accounts, and the income that had made the life on Maple Grove Drive possible had come from assets that Camille had built before he met her and had maintained throughout their marriage in her own name, and the income from his pharmaceutical sales position, which he had thought of as the primary financial contribution to their shared life, had been in fact the smaller of the 2 contributions, and the larger had always been Camille's and would remain Camille's because it was built and documented and protected in a way that reflected precisely who had built it and who had maintained it and whose name it had always carried and always been registered under. Keisha left 2 weeks after the letter arrived, and she left without drama and without a speech, and the warmth she had brought to 8 months of Estelle's careful introduction cooled with the efficiency of warmth that belongs to a situation rather than to a person, and Estelle called her, and Keisha was polite and said she had not understood the full picture when she became involved, and that she needed to make decisions that were right for her own life, and Estelle listened, and when the call ended, she sat in her kitchen in Beverly and thought about the morning she had stood on the Maple Grove Drive doorstep with so much preparation and so much confidence, and about the woman who had opened the door and listened to the speech and left without a word, and Estelle thought about that quietness for a long time, and about what it had actually meant, and about all the things she had not thought to ask before she rang that doorbell, and about the specific and permanent difference between a question you ask before you make a decision and a question you ask after the consequences of that decision have already arrived. The closing on the house on Maple Grove Drive happened on schedule, and the purchasing party took possession, and Victor vacated the home he had lived in for 9 years and went to stay with his mother in Beverly in the room he had not occupied since his 20s, and Estelle could not help him in the ways that the situation required help because Estelle did not have the resources the situation required, and the family could not help because the family did not have what the situation required either, and Victor Washington sat in his mother's house in Beverly and thought about the morning Estelle had arrived with Keisha, and the speech, and the way Camille picked up her handbag and left without a single raised word, and he understood now with a completeness that had not been available to him before that. The quietness of that departure was not the quietness of someone who had nothing left. It was the quietness of someone who had already done everything that needed to be done and was simply making room for the consequences to arrive on the schedule that had been set 14 months earlier by a woman who understood that the most powerful position available to anyone in any situation is the position of someone who is already prepared for every outcome before the other side has started asking the questions that would have told them what they were actually dealing with. Camille Reeves Washington is 43 years old now, and she lives in a condominium in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago that she purchased 14 months before the morning Estelle rang the doorbell, and that she has been renovating in the specific, careful, unhurried way, and Reeves Properties LLC has added 3 properties to the portfolio in the 2 years since Maple Grove Drive, and the business is growing steadily, and the clients trust her because she has been doing this correctly and consistently for 14 years, and the trust that produces is the durable kind that compounds over time the way good assets compound over time. She told me that the thing she thinks about most from those 14 months between calling Sandra and the morning the doorbell rang is not the morning itself, and it is not the day the house closed, and it is not the evening she heard that Keisha had left. The thing she thinks about most is the afternoon she walked into Sandra's office and said, "I need you to make sure everything I own is documented correctly and protected completely because that was the moment she stopped postponing a decision she had been approaching for months and started doing the work that the decision required. And she also thinks about Jerome at the kitchen table in Woodlawn with the piece of paper with numbers on it explaining in plain language what it means to own something versus what it means to occupy something, and about the fact that she had spent her entire adult life building on that lesson. Here is what stays with me about Camille Washington. Estelle rang that doorbell with a speech and a woman in the full confidence of someone who believed they understood the situation they were entering and what they were capable of producing by entering it. And what Estelle did not understand, and what Victor did not understand, and what Keisha did not understand was that the woman who opened the door and listened to the speech and picked up her handbag and left without a single word was not leaving because she had run out of things to say, or because she had no response available to her, or because the speech had produced in her the defeat that Estelle had anticipated when she said, "I told you she would not fight." She was leaving because everything that needed to be said had already been said in documents and property records and business registrations and legal structures that none of the people in that living room had ever thought to ask about, and that said more clearly and more permanently than anything Camille could have said standing in that doorway that the house was hers and the business was hers and the properties were hers and the financial foundation of 9 years of shared life was hers and had always been hers and was going to remain hers because she had built it and documented it and protected it with the same meticulous attention her father had taught her at a kitchen table in Woodlawn when she was 11 years old, sitting with a piece of paper with numbers on it and learning for the first time the difference between owning something and occupying something, and why that difference was the most important thing a person could understand about the life they were trying to build. Estelle had chosen the new wife, and Camille had chosen to take everything, and the difference between those two choices was invisible on the morning the doorbell rang, and was completely and permanently visible 6 weeks later when there was nothing left on Victor's side of the ledger that had not always belonged to Camille, and that Camille had not already decided exactly what to do with. So here is what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about the morning Camille left. She heard the speech, and she looked at Keisha standing in her living room, and she picked up her handbag, and she walked out without a single word. Do you think you could have done what she did? Do you think you could have walked out of your own house in that specific silence, knowing everything she knew about what was already in motion, and said absolutely nothing? To the people who were standing in your living room, treating your house as though it was theirs to give away, because most people in that situation would have said something, and the something they said would have told the other side that they were responding rather than executing, and Camille knew the difference between responding and executing, and she chose to execute. And the second question is about Estelle. She arrived that morning believing completely that she understood the situation she was walking into, and that the speech she had prepared and the woman she had brought with her represented a solution to a problem she had diagnosed correctly over 9 years of careful maternal observation. She had never once asked her son what his wife actually owned, or what his own name was on, or what the financial architecture of their shared life actually looked like in concrete documented terms. Do you think Estelle ever understood after everything that happened what the question was that she should have asked before she rang that doorbell? Or do you think she found a way to understand what happened that preserved her original view of Camille and of her own role in what occurred? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce the longest and most passionate comment conversation we have had on this channel, because every person watching has a strong opinion about every person in this story, and we want to hear all of them. If this story made you think about what you actually own and what is actually documented in your name, and what would happen if someone decided to test that documentation, share it with someone who needs to think about those questions. Hit the like button if Camille Washington reminded you of someone you know, and subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.